Each year we invite prominent speakers to speak on a different aspect of human rights. This year we are delighted to have Nancy Kaufman speak on Jewish social justice in the era of Trump. Nancy has had a distinguished career as a public servant, advocate and non-profit leader. She recently stepped down as CEO of National Council in the US, where she served from 2011 to 2019. At National Council, she re-energised this 125-year-old legacy organisation of volunteers and advocates that turn progressive ideals into action. National Council in the US advances social and economic justice for women, children and families, and safeguards individual rights and freedoms in both the USA and Israel. Prior to joining National Council, Nancy served as the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Boston for 20 years, where she led the social justice, Israel democracy and governmental affairs agendas for Boston's Jewish Federation and its agencies. She's also held a variety of positions related to health and human services delivery in state and local government and in the non-for-profit sector. She worked for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in the Governor's Office, Mike Dukakis that was at that time, as an Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services, and was Deputy Commissioner of the Welfare Department, where she oversaw the state's anti-homelessness initiative, innovative childcare projects, social and mental health community programs, and the employment and training programs for the state. She was also founding director of a community action agency north of Boston that continues to this day as a vibrant voice for poor and underserved communities in the northern suburbs of Boston. She's an honours graduate of Brandeis University, received a Master of Social Work from the Boston College School of Social Work, as well as a mid-career Master's in Public Administration from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, where she received the prestigious Littauer Award for Excellence. She's also a recipient of an honorary doctorate in public service from Northeastern University, and among other honours, she received an award for greatest contribution to social policy from the National Association of Social Workers, the Alumni Achievement Award and the Bernard Reisman Award for Professional Excellence from Brandeis University, the Woman of Valor Award from the Jewish Funds for Justice, and the Albert D. Chernin Award from the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. I give you Nancy Kaufman.
Thank you, Mary. My mother would have loved that introduction. Too bad she's not with us anymore. It is such a pleasure to be here. I said earlier today to a group that we were dining with that it's so wonderful to be a place where the way I speak I'm not made fun of, because you all drop your R's just like I do. So it's great to be in Melbourne. I want to thank Miriam and Leanne for inviting me to give this prestigious award. I particularly want to thank Miriam for showing me. I told her she should be a paid tour guide, because she has shown me the ups and downs and ins and outs of Melbourne. I also want to thank Viv and Philip Brass for hosting me in their lovely home. I told Viv today that I plan to make Aliyah to Melbourne, and she should make room for me there, because I'm ready to move in. But it is really, particularly wonderful to be able to give this lecture in the name of Fanny Redding and her colleague of many years past, Hannah G. Solomon. You should know that Hannah G. Solomon was a visionary leader. She was a petite little woman of 4'11", and she was a Reform Jew. She had been born in Germany, was fluent in German, and her great claim to fame, and we're very proud of her, is that in 1893, as Miriam mentioned, when she founded NCJW, she was invited to organize a group of Jewish women volunteers to go to the World's Fair in Chicago to the Academy of World Religions, and when they got there, they were invited to pour the coffee. And they said, Jewish women can do more than pour coffee, and they walked out. And that was how NCJW first began, as an organization of Jewish women in order to help all people, and at the time, a lot of immigrant women who were coming to the United States. So that's sort of a little more of the history, and I'm really wonderful to hear the history of Fanny Redding, because they clearly were contemporaries and clearly worked together. in building this amazing organization. So let me begin by just saying that a little factoid is that I was the first CEO of NCJW in 120 years. NCJW had been had an operating board, not a governing board, and never had a CEO until I was hired in 2011. And at that time, NCJW had been a totally volunteer-driven organization, like many of the sections are in our country today and here in Australia and other places. I came to NCJW from a long career in Boston and my home in Boston because of my passion for social justice and my passion and my belief that if anyone was going to change the world, it was going to be women because, sorry, present company excluded, men had screwed it up to a fairly well. And that we needed women to take some leadership and to really stand up and speak their voices in a loud and clear way. So that's sort of the backdrop. I had the privilege of leading NCJW to a new level in its goal of becoming the preeminent Jewish women's organization in the United States. I'm proud of all we did during my tenure to realize the goal of advancing social and economic justice for Jewish women, for women, children, and families in Israel and the United States. And we do that both nationally and locally in the United States through the 60 sections that operate across the country. So to our topic, Jewish social justice in the era of Trump. After the elections in 2016, NCJW in the United States, along with dozens of other Jewish social justice and secular organizations, felt compelled to intensify our work in order to defend our democracy and protect the government policies and programs that we had so successfully advocated for in order to promote the well-being of women and children. These policies include, but are not limited to, reproductive health rights and justice, a fair and independent judiciary, voter rights and civil liberties, immigrant rights, and upholding the laws governing refugees and asylum seekers, preventing gun violence and violence against women, and economic policies supporting women and families, including family and medical leave and closing the wage gap. So in addition to discussing a few of these initiatives, because I'm not going to have time tonight unless we're going to stay a very long time to discuss them all, I will also present some of the work of at least one of our sister organizations as an example of how we have pivoted and increased our advocacy in light of the 2016 elections. When taken together, these efforts have combined to really uplift the Jewish social justice movement in the United States because of the age of Trump. Before I do that, however, I want to place this discussion in a broader framework that goes beyond the person of Donald Trump, our current president, and speaks to the crisis that is looming large in our American democracy. And I think it's important that we contextualize this because we are a nonpartisan, non-political organization, and we continue to be that. It's a crisis that many of us are stunned by because of our deep-seated belief in the strength of the U.S. Constitution and the brilliance of our founding fathers, who, so we thought, constructed a vision and a set of laws that would guide our country through the diverse ideologies of any particular leaders and political parties, and would serve as a check on their political and personality differences. So it is with a great deal of alarm and concern that we find ourselves questioning the very principles upon which our American system was constructed. To put this concern in a larger context, I want to share with you a recent analysis by the highly regarded U.S. historian John Meacham. In a recent essay he wrote on the topic, Meacham provides a historical context by reminding us that nearly a half a century after Alex de Tocqueville's writing of Democracy in America, James Bryce, an English historian and statesman, crossed the sea to assess the state of the American experiment. As Meacham explains, Bryce arrived in the 1880s at a time when the United States was grappling with inequalities in wealth, rising levels of immigration, rapid economic transition, and question about the United States' role in the world. A time not too dissimilar to where we were in advance of the 2016 elections. Bryce was a politician and a professor of civil law at Oxford, and would later become the British ambassador to the United States. He published his reflections in a 2-volume work entitled The American Commonwealth. Meacham recounts that among Bryce's insights was a warning of the dangers of a renegade president. This is in the 1880s. Bryce believed that the real threat to the United States Constitution came as much from the people as it did from the White House. According to Bryce, disaster would strike American democracy at the hands of a demagogic president with an enthusiastic public base. In Bryce's prophetic words, a bold president who knew himself to be supported by a majority in the country might be tempted to override the law. He might be a tyrant, not against the masses, but with the masses. It's a direct quote from Bryce in the 1880s. As Meacham reflects on Bryce's words, he says the following, and I quote, "Bryce's prophecy has come true. The rise of Donald Trump and the reflexive resilience of his public support has produced a singular American moment." Meacham further opines that as the debate over impeachment removal unfolds, the nation's immediate and long-term future depends on whether Americans will be guided by reason rather than passion, fact rather than faith, evidence rather than tribe. The current situation in the United States is sadly ripe for demagoguery. As Meacham points out, there's been a return to the kind of partisan media that shaped us in the 18th and 19th centuries. Relentless gerrymandering that has produced few swing congressional districts, and the allure of reality TV programming that has blurred lines between entertainment and governance. Meacham goes on in his essay to give us hope by quoting President Harry Truman during another dark time in world history, when he famously said, "The people have often made mistakes, but given time and the facts, they will make the corrections." This, as Meacham so rightly points out, is not a red point or a blue point. It is, in fact, a true point, as he recalls moments in our history when change did occur, from Seneca Falls and the launch of the women's movement to Montgomery, Alabama, and the launch of the civil rights movement, from the Berlin Wall being torn down to Soviet Jews being freed, from Stonewall revolt by gays and lesbians to gay marriage becoming the law of the land. Americans and democracy-believing people around the world have sought to pursue justice and repair our broken world, or as Meacham puts it, to nudge the world toward an ethos of liberty rather than tyranny. It is into this world that Jewish organizations in the United States have been thrust over the past 3 years. You may ask, isn't that crossing the line from nonpartisan advocacy to political activism? However, I would respond by recalling the words of Eleanor Roosevelt when she offered some of her very wise advice, and she had a lot of it, during the partisan times of her day, saying, and I quote, "It is not only important, but mentally invigorating to discuss political matters when people whose opinions differ radically from one's own, with people whose opinions differ radically from one's own." Mrs. Roosevelt understood what current-day American politicians seem to have forgotten, that we need to, in her words, find out what people are saying, what they are thinking, what they believe. This, says Eleanor, is an invaluable check on one's own ideas, because if we are to cope intelligently with a changing world, we must be flexible and willing to relinquish opinions that no longer have any bearing on existing conditions. Put in modern-day terms, I am sure Eleanor would advise us not to follow the tweets or pronouncements coming from any one source. This mandate for us as Jews to be activists and upstanders, not bystanders, was foremost in my mind this past Friday when I toured the Jewish Museum here in Melbourne with Viv and Miriam. It seemed to me, and it was very striking to me, that it's no coincidence that an entire part of the exhibit is devoted to activism, with a clear message to all, and I quote as follows: "There is a long history of Jews working to make change to better the world," it says right in this big poster, "of Jews fighting for justice for themselves and for others, of Jews in Melbourne reckoning with the world around them, making space for solidarities, for new ideas and ways of envisioning the world. Look to the margins, and you'll find something worth focusing on." There you go. And we have so many examples of Jewish activism that Miriam just discussed here in Victoria, and such inspiring role models from so many of your great leaders throughout your over 90 years since Fanny Redding had the vision to found NCJW. So against this backdrop, with the words of our own United States founder always at the top of mind when she said that Jewish women have a responsibility to go into the public square to do what our convictions demand. In addition to sharing the ways in which NCJW has pivoted since the 2016 elections, I also want to talk a little bit about some of the many other organizations, because taken together, you'll be able to get a good picture of the ways in which we are acting on our most core mandate to pursue justice and help repair our very broken world. So let me start with NCJW. Immediately following the election in 2016, the National Board of NCJW met and discussed the path forward. As we anticipated, many of the policies and programs we had been advocates for might very well be tested and possibly defunded and eliminated. It was for this reason that we made an early decision to mobilize our grassroots and support the Women's March in Washington, D.C. and across the country in January 2017. This decision was not made lightly, as there were concerns expressed about the potential for anti-Israel and pro-BDS rhetoric and demonstrations. We did our due diligence, as NCJW always does, and we worked with the march organizers to ensure that the march would be focused only on domestic issues and there would be no anti-Israel speakers. We also participated in advising the steering committee for the march on the principles that would guide the march. We were pleased at the result and played a major role in organizing the Jewish community to participate, with thousands of people marching not only in Washington, D.C., but in marches across the country in cities and towns. This all happened, I will say, prior to the later politicization of the march, but we can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. Given the potentially overwhelming scale of the new challenges the Trump administration presented, we decided we would focus our domestic work on three priority areas: reproductive health rights and justice, the importance of a fair and independent judiciary, and voter and civic engagement. NCJW has always based its work on core Jewish values that respect the importance of religious liberty and freedom in decisions about our bodies, our health, our families, and our communities. Since its founding in 1893, NCJW has been a leader in the reproductive health and rights movement in the United States. And while there has been much advancement in the past 100 years to legally securing a person's right to abortion and contraception, I know some of this sounds a little foreign to some of you, there is so much more that needs to be done to truly ensure reproductive freedoms for all. Soon after I arrived in 2011 at NCJW, we went through a process of reassessing our reproductive rights work. We concluded that it was time to go beyond the basics of advocating rights and dig deeper into understanding that our work needed to include a justice framework that would more intentionally include the voices of those who've been marginalized and put them at the center of leading the conversation designed to advance social change. Thus, in 2012, NCJW added justice to its reproductive health and rights work. And we spent time learning from those communities who had been pushing to be more central to the advocacy agenda of the women's rights community. We concluded that every person, despite the color of their skin or their economic status, needed to have the power to make their own informed decisions about their body, sexuality, and futures. And if not, our work would not be complete. One example of our advocacy in this area is something known as the Hyde Amendment that was initiated by Representative Henry Hyde over 40 years ago and continues to stand in the way of marginalized communities having access to abortion. The Hyde Amendment, while not permanent law, has been repeatedly included as an amendment in the annual appropriation bills submitted by both Democratic and Republican administrations. Simply put, this measure not only denies abortion coverage for any federally funded program, so Medicaid, Medicare, Children's Health Insurance, Peace Corps, military personnel, federal employees and dependents, Native Americans receiving assistance, pregnant individuals in federal prisons, as well as women receiving care from community health centers and survivors of human trafficking. They cannot get an abortion paid for by government. Not allowed. Following the election in 2016, not only was the chance of reversing the Hyde Amendment deemed practically impossible, the Congress was not about to entertain changing it, the White House was not about to entertain changing it, so we joined with a number of other national women's organizations to support a new piece of legislation entitled Each Women Act, the Equal Access to Abortion Coverage and Health Insurance. The act would bar local, state, and federal political interference in the decisions of private health insurers to offer abortion coverage. It would ensure health coverage of abortion for every person, regardless of income or type of insurance or where they live. It would reassert respect for moral agency and religious liberty by restoring access to coverage and by making it clear that it is unjust and unconstitutional to enshrine one religious view into law that infringes on the religious views of another. Again, while it may be hard for some of you here to understand how important this is in the United States, for us, the abortion access issue is an economic issue as much as it is a health issue. Controlling family timing and size is essential to economic success, educational achievement, and equality. It's a Jewish issue because even among our most orthodox rabbis who we have studied with the issue, they teach that the decision to have an abortion is connected to the health of the mother, which is always primary, and it's a private family matter. So to prevent the undermining of those basic rights, a second piece of legislation was introduced post-Trump called the Women's Health Protection Act, and that was first introduced in 2017 and reintroduced in 2019. The act is based on the belief that access to comprehensive, affordable, and equitable health care is every person's right. It grows out of the disturbing reality, just hear this, in the first 3 months of 2019, state lawmakers at the state level introduced more than 300 laws promoting abortion restrictions that were added to the over 400 laws that were introduced since 2010. These medically unnecessary regulations increase costs, decrease efficiency and the number of providers, delay procedures, and negatively impact the quality of safe and legal abortion by shuttering clinics across the country, and that's what has happened. They have served to limit a woman's power to make an informed decision by legislating, in many cases, misinformation or requiring clinically unnecessary services like ultrasounds, in-person counseling, and waiting periods. Many of these laws have been designed to purposely undermine the constitutional right to personal liberty and equal protection under the law, including the right to choose an abortion regardless of one's zip code. The Women's Health Protection Act is designed to stave off the continued attempts by states to undermine the law of the land in the United States, Roe v. Wade, which was a decision by the Supreme Court in 1973. With more than 20 pending lawsuits making their way through the lower courts, NCJW believes the time is now to address these threats through federal legislation. The act would create a new tool for safeguarding access to high-quality care and securing constitutional rights by protecting patients and providers from political interference. The problem is our balance of powers is not working so well in the United States, because while there's a Democratic House, there's a Republican Senate. Those who have been watching the hearings know that the Republicans are not exactly going to do anything that runs in the face of what the Trump administration wants. So as you can see, we're asserting ourselves in the marketplace of advocacy at the level of our Congress. But without the backup support of our federal courts, any legislation could be vulnerable to being tested in that arena. It's for this reason, ever since the decision in Roe v. Wade in 1973, NCJW has been a vocal and consistent voice for a fair and independent judiciary. In the era of Trump, this advocacy has become ever more important and crucial to the ultimate test of our democracy. NCJW has necessarily redoubled its efforts in this regard. Judges in the United States are confirmed for lifetime seats on the federal courts, including the Supreme Court. These judges make decisions that impact every aspect of our lives: the schools we attend, our privacy, our ability to choose when and whether to start a family, the safety of the products we buy and the drugs we take, our religious freedom, and our voting rights. Through a campaign called Benchmark, NCJW's Judicial Nominations Campaign, NCJW has been a leading voice in the community's fight to ensure a fair and independent judiciary, with an unwavering commitment to constitutional rights. We have mobilized a powerful grassroots network that works to educate communities across the country about the importance of a federal judiciary. We also work in coalition with other national organizations to advocate for court vacancies to be filled by nominees who are committed to constitutional values. Historically, the nomination and confirmation of federal judges has always been a distinctly bipartisan, often collaborative endeavor, and this goes back through all kinds of Republican and Democratic administrations until now. Sadly, under the current Senate leader, Mitch McConnell, this has become a decidedly partisan affair. During the Obama administration, the Senate did everything possible to slow down the appointment of federal judges, with few getting approved during Obama's term. The most public effort that you probably followed was the absolute refusal of the United States Senate to even grant a hearing on the nomination by Obama to fill the vacancy left by the death of Supreme Court Justice Scalia. The president put forward the name of a moderate jurist, Merrick Garland, and not only did the Senate refuse to approve the nomination, they refused to give him a hearing. In response, NCJW launched the Do Your Job campaign. And at our Washington Institute, you saw the one that Miriam and some others of you went to. At our Washington Institute 3 years ago in 2016, we marched from the Supreme Court holding copies of the Constitution from the Supreme Court to Capitol Hill, urging our senators to do their job. All we were asking them to do was to hold a hearing. Several of us then met with the Judiciary Committee staff in Senator Grassley's office to present him with copies, thousands of copies of postcards that each of us had written from 30 states across the country, urging the senator to lead the committee in doing their job. In the United States, the Senate has a duty to confirm individuals to lifetime seats. The nonpartisan American Bar Association has traditionally evaluated judicial candidates before they are nominated. And until the ushering in of the Trump era, the White House and the Senate Judiciary Committee have considered those evaluations before moving forward with any nomination. Again, bipartisan in Republican and Democratic administrations. These American Bar Association ratings have always been based on objective assessments of candidates' competence, principles, and temperament. Sadly, the Senate Judiciary Committee has ceased honoring these valuable reviews, no longer accepting them, and they have confirmed multiple nominees that have been rated not qualified. Another tradition that has been totally ignored is for home state senators to be consulted on the potential nominee from their districts for their input. This practice is known as blue slips, has also been totally ignored. The intent of our founding fathers, I would suggest, was to establish 3 branches of government so each could serve as a check and balance on the other. This administration has done everything it can to push through judges at all levels of the federal court who are not qualified to sit on the bench. Perhaps the most public example of this miscarriage of justice was the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to serve in the Supreme Court, despite the very credible and powerful allegations of sexual assault. The final vote came on the heels of an unprecedented display of blatant partisanship by Kavanaugh during his confirmation hearings, in which he put forward conspiracy theories that echoed his long career in conservative politics. His appearance drew more than 80 serious ethics complaints that were dismissed only because lower court judges do not have legal authority to discipline Supreme Court justices. After his confirmation, new information came to light, strongly indicating that there had been little or no meaningful investigation by the Senate or the FBI into Kavanaugh's past. But the Kavanaugh appointment was not an anomaly. Rather, he embodies the major issues that make up the packing of the courts with conservative jurists with no accountability or oversight. In the era of Trump, the Senate's conservative leadership under McConnell actually changed the rules of the Senate to make it easier to approve judges. By now, we're only requiring a 2/3 vote for replacing the previous rule that required a 2/3 votes for confirmation with just a simple majority. And while they slowed down the process under Obama, leaving 110 nominees languishing when he left office, they have now sped up the process to such an extent that hearings and markups are packed with too many nominees to properly vet, including approving some when the Senate was actually in recess. The result has been, in his first 2 years in office, Trump appointed more than 90 judges, which is more than 1/10 of the entire federal judiciary, and 20% of the appellate courts. It is estimated that by the end of this term, Trump could pack the court with more than 250 judges, which would be 1/3 of the entire federal judiciary. And I'll just give you one example. Just last week, the Senate voted to confirm Sarah Pitlick, someone that NCJW vehemently opposed, for a seat on the U.S. District Court of Missouri. And our St. Louis section in Missouri was extremely active. Pitlick has dedicated her career to rolling back reproductive freedoms, including birth control, and holds strong positions against in vitro fertilization and surrogacy. She earned a unanimous, not qualified rating from the American Bar Association. She has never tried a case or led a case as a lead or co-counsel, whether civil or criminal. She has never examined a witness. She has never argued any motion in a state or federal trial court. She has never picked a jury, and nevertheless, she was confirmed to a lifetime appointment on the court. So the question I assume is looming large in your minds is, what can we do? What can be done? What has the action been for NCJW in light of these daunting challenges? Well, the obvious answer is to use our voices and our votes to speak out. So not surprisingly, the third priority for NCJW following the 2016 election has been civic and voter engagement. In a democracy, the one basic right we have is the vote. And again, you are an example because you have compulsory voting. We do not. Not sure why, but we don't. Our vote is our voice, yet there have been systematic efforts to exclude individuals from the electoral process. And sadly, unlike Australia, people are not voting in the way they should. Buoyed by the U.S. Supreme Court's 2013 Shelby versus Holder decision, which gutted the landmark 1965 Voting Rights Act that LBJ was very well known for, conservative lawmakers in states around the country have passed dozens of laws making it more difficult for people to vote, particularly people of color, women, and individuals with disabilities, and LGBTQ individuals. The result has been to make it increasingly difficult for communities to elect people who represent their values. The response by NCJW and others in the social justice space has been to energize the grassroots, to work to pass legislation to modernize our electoral systems and make it easier for people to register and cast a ballot without question or cross-examination. NCJW in the United States has for many years worked on voter rights, and every 4 years we run a Promote the Vote, Protect the Vote campaign. As you can imagine, the interest at the grassroots has spiraled as a result of the 2016 elections. And then again in 2018, when people actually saw the fruits of their labors with the midterm elections. While NCJW continues to be a proud, what we call 501c3 nonprofit, non-political organization, we are allowed to work on nonpartisan voter registration, getting people to the polls, getting people out to vote, as long as we don't weigh in on any particular party or candidate. We are also allowed to work on ballot questions, and we've had several big wins in 2018 at the ballot box. As we approach the 2020 elections, NCJW has launched its Promote the Vote, Protect the Vote 2020 campaign. The campaign includes materials on voter registration, voter education, and how to get out the vote. It is being run like a political campaign with Promote the Vote captains who will plan and execute voter engagement events. A national will lead a cohort of the Protect the Vote captains and provide resource and training to help them be effective local advocates, which is what we see as the role of national. Local sections are encouraged to partner with other local organizations who are involved with voter education and recruitment work. Some of the strategies include bringing voter registration forms to all local events, service projects, contacting every person who attended a section event in the past year, et cetera, et cetera. Beyond voter engagement, NCJW National also sponsors a monthly webinar series designed to stimulate broader civic engagement through community organizing techniques. The series, which is entitled Lead, Organizing Skills for Grassroots Advocates, focuses on one skill each month through interactive discussions. Some of the topics have included abortion and voter suppression, abortion and faith messaging, digital activism through social media, and responding to anti-Semitic occurrences in local communities, among others. All this work is accompanied by National's work in Washington on getting legislation passed to fix the devastation wrought with the Supreme Court's decision on Shelby versus Holder, which I previously mentioned, which completely gutted the 1965 Voter Rights Act. We're actively supporting a new bill known as the Voting Rights Advancement Act, which has been introduced for the third time in 3 consecutive years to Congress. That would restore Voting Rights Act by requiring states with 15 or more voting rights violations in the past 25 years to clear changes to election laws with the Department of Justice. The horrors of the past 6 years since the Supreme Court ruling just underlines the words of Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her dissent to the Shelby versus Holder decision when she wrote, and I quote, as only Ruth Bader Ginsburg can say, "Throwing out the Voting Rights Act when it has worked to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet." Congress has the power to end the deluge of voter suppression, so NCJW advocates are making their voices heard in their districts and in Congress with their elected representatives. One of the successes that we had was we led a campaign in Florida in 2018 where voters restored access through a ballot initiative to 1.5 million formerly incarcerated people who are not being allowed to vote. And with help, NCJW led efforts in Michigan and Nevada to implement automatic voter registration. So you might think from my presentation so far that NCJW is the only Jewish organization in the United States that has pivoted since the 2016 U.S. elections. But that is hardly the case. I don't have time to present all the many ways that many organizations have done so, but there's one that I'd really want to mention, and that is the HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. The HIAS is, well, before I do that, let me just mention that one of the things that we did was to create the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. This is a roundtable that I was one of the founders of about 12 years ago. It started with 6 organizations. It now has more than 60. And it was, other than NCJW and the Reform Movement, believe it or not, there wasn't a lot happening in social justice at that time. But we got support from a number of foundations, and we have grown that. The mission of the roundtable is to be a network that strengthens and aligns the Jewish social justice field in order to make justice a core expression of Jewish life and to help create an equitable world. The network envisions a loving, caring, and equitable world in which power is shared and all are free from injustice. In this world, we live out our Jewish traditions of justice, embrace the beauty and multiplicity of Jewish identities, overcome past and present oppressions, and trust in ourselves, one another, and our partners to pursue justice together. The core Jewish values upon which the Roundtable are based are very similar to the core Jewish values that NCJW is based. Tzedek, justice; B'Tselem Elohim, all people are created in the image of God; and Chesed, loving kindness. The Roundtable supports the network to advance justice issues and pursues long-term change by amplifying voices across the field, helping Roundtable organizations develop an anti-oppression lens and address complex issues including racism, anti-Semitism, and internalized trauma, as well as issues related to Israel. More recently, the Roundtable has put considerable attention on racial justice and being more inclusive of Jews of color. Someone said to me yesterday, Jews of color? Yes, it's about 15% of the Jewish community in America are Jews of color who have not been adequately represented on boards or staffs of our organizations. So let me fast forward and just say the one organization I do want to highlight, because I think it's important, I think it has relevance to you here from what I've heard over the last few years, and that is HIAS. And probably most Jews in America, it's a 130-year-old organization, you've probably heard of it. The Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society is what it was known at. It was initially formed to assist Jews fleeing pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe. Since then, HIAS has touched the life of nearly every Jewish family in America, and now welcomes all people who flee persecution. From the beginnings as a storefront in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a group of American Jews organized to provide aid to the Jews fleeing the waves of anti-Semitic riots. As the director recently said to me, HIAS was initially formed to help refugees because they were Jewish. And now we help refugees because we are Jewish. Over their 130-year history, HIAS has pivoted many times. And HIAS and NCJW, just a historical note, were the only 2 NGOs at the early 1900s who were given permission by the government to welcome people coming to Ellis Island and prevent people, in NCJW's case, women from becoming trafficked, in HIAS's case, to help people get resettled. And the outbreak of World War I brought the largest influx of Jews from Eastern Europe, but it was not long before restrictions were imposed limiting the number of immigrants allowed into America to no more than 2% of the total of each nationality residing in the United States in 1890. As we all know too well, precious few refugees were rescued during World War II due to the restrictive National Origins Act of 1924. And it was not until 1965 that the National Origins Act was replaced with a new law liberalizing decades of restrictive admissions policies. In fact, the resettling of about 150,000 people in 330 communities was done by HIAS, including Canada, here in Australia, and South America. It was, as Miriam mentioned, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights following the war, as well as the 1951 Refugee Convention, that became the basis for U.S. asylum law, giving HIAS the mandate for all future work assisting refugees, no matter where they came from. So in addition to settling hundreds of thousands of Jews from Hungary and the Soviet Union, HIAS was called upon by the U.S. government to resettle Vietnamese, Cambodian, Laotian refugees as a response to the war in Vietnam in the 70s. Since that time, they've been wherever conflicts are in the world. They are present in 16 countries from South America to Africa. So it's no wonder that HIAS has led the Jewish community in responding to the Trump administration's efforts to turn back decades of American policy concerning immigrants and refugees and return to a time that we do not, I would suggest, as Jews, want to remember, when we were turned away from the shores of so many countries. To put this in context, despite a record 25.9 million refugees worldwide now, half of whom are children under the age of 18, the United States under Trump capped refugee resettlement to 45,000, an all-time low since the Refugee Act was passed in 1980, and established a system, when it was passed, for deciding how many refugees to resettle. In 2018, because of the Muslim ban imposed by the Trump administration through an executive order, and because of the anti-immigrant policies of this administration, only 22,000 refugees were allowed into the United States. To put this in context, the average number over the past 40 years has been 96,000 a year. So it just gives you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about. The number's more significant than just a figure, because America's always felt that we were a safe haven for resettlement of refugees. And by refugee, I should note, I mean someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin due to well-founded fear of being prosecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, or membership in a particular social group, and that's the United Nations High Commission definition. As a response to this, HIAS is taking legal action for the first time in their history and has filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration. In a statement announcing the suit, they said, "Our history and values as Jews and as Americans require us to fight this illegal and immoral new policy with every tool at our disposal, including litigation." The suit asked the courts to strike down the harmful, discriminatory, and unconstitutional law. And in addition to halting all refugee resettlement, the order signed on January 27, 2017, a week after Donald Trump was inaugurated as president, bans people from 7 Muslim countries with the exception of non-Muslim religious minorities. National security experts have described this as unnecessary and counterproductive, and a federal judge ruled that it posed an imminent danger of substantial and irreparable injury to refugees, visa holders, and other individuals. HIAS has challenged the constitutionality of the executive order and includes several other legal claims, including the concern that the order is at odds with the statute by Congress that guides the refugee program. NCJW and many other Jewish social justice organizations has joined the brief and promulgated with them a day of Jewish action for refugees. Perhaps nowhere have the policies of the Trump administration, however, been more visible than at our southern border with Mexico. I had the honor of traveling to the border a year ago as a representative of NCJW with HIAS and witnessed firsthand the ways in which asylum seekers are being treated in direct violation of our own asylum laws. Many people attempting to legally seek asylum as they enter the United States at our southern border are being treated as criminals, and thousands of families have been torn apart. HIAS and many other Jewish and secular organizations have responded and have launched an emergency response program, placing border fellows at the border, putting observers there, leading delegation of pro bono attorneys. And I have to tell you that as one of those witnesses, I can't tell you how ashamed I felt as an American and as a Jew that in 2018, my country is treating people who have legitimate fears of violence and persecution in their home countries as criminals, shackled. We actually went to bond hearings and they were brought in shackles. As bad as the treatment of the adults is, it is nothing compared to the hundreds of children who've been separated from their parents and placed in shelters, sometimes thousands of miles away. In August 2019, HIAS opened an office in Mexico, funded by the UN High Commission on Civil Rights, on refugee rights, in collaboration with the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, and is providing a Know Your Rights program, flagging cases to refer to their border fellows and to lawyers. Having witnessed some of these bond hearings of the asylum seeker, I can tell you that it's compelling, and when you hear their stories of what they fled from Central America and South America, it's just wrenching. In fact, we went to Tijuana, we went over the border, and we went to a shelter where we saw 3 men who the day before we had seen shackled in a bond hearing who had been deported overnight and in chains. And it's really very disturbing. The only solution is to change U.S. immigration policies, and the only way that will happen is if the grassroots is mobilized and organized to show up for our elections in November 2020. What is encouraging in this rather depressing analysis I've presented is the extent to which the Jewish community has been energized and has stepped forward to respond. I've pointed to just a few of the ways we've done this on just a couple of the issues that we have responded to. I could easily go on and tell you about the work around mass incarceration and gun violence prevention, or efforts around climate change and food insecurity, or economic policies to support women and families, but suffice it to say that one clear outcome of the Trump presidency has been to stimulate people to raise their voices and take action. I'll now close how I began, with a reminder of the vision of our founding fathers and with some final words from our own founding mother. As David Remnick so poignantly related in a recent column in the New Yorker magazine, and I quote, "Long before Alexander Hamilton became an icon of the Broadway stage, he glimpsed the harrowing qualities of a man like Donald Trump. He envisaged the rise of a demagogue who would put liberty and the rule of law at risk and place his own interests before those of the country. As Remnick reminds us, and I quote, writing to George Washington in 1792, Hamilton seemed to anticipate our current moment as follows. When a man unprincipled in private life, desperate in his fortune, bold in his temper, possessed of considerable talents, is seen to mount the hobby horse of popularity, to join in the cry of danger to liberty, to take every opportunity of embarrassing the general government and bringing it under suspicion, to flatter and fall in with all the nonsense of the zealots of the day, it may justly be suspected that his object is to throw things into confusion, that he may, quote, ride the storm and direct the whirlwind." That was last week, New Yorker magazine. So let me close by returning to the inspiration that so many of us in the United States received, as you did, from your founder, from our founder. And as Mary mentioned, at a time when women did not have a seat at most tables, not only in the Jewish community, but in the community at large, Hannah G. Solomon saw an opportunity to make a difference, and she sprang into action in order to mobilize women across the United States, and indeed the world, through the International Council of Jewish Women, to act on their most particular Jewish values and direct them to solving problems of universal social concern. Hannah G. knew at the outset that the leadership of women would not immediately be accepted by the Jewish community. She explained that to join an organization of women, not ladies, and one that bore the title club rather than society, was in itself a radical step. She warned members to be prepared for critics to, quote, mourn over our neglected children and wonder how our husbands would manage without us. As she recalled later in her life, that in the 1890s, she was considered quite radical for her public speaking and her organizational activity. It should be noted that Hannah G. always considered herself a passionate advocate of Judaism and Jewish values, and believed that philanthropy, education, and social service was an extension of Jewish obligation. Suffice it to say, I believe, and I hope you agree, that it is our responsibility as Jewish women to go into the world as she challenged us to do, and do what our convictions demand. For as we learned from Rabbi Tafon and Pirkei Avot, it is not our responsibility to complete the work, but we are not free to desist either. Thank you for your attention. And I'd be happy to take questions. Yeah? Thank you. Happy to take any questions or comments.
We have a microphone, so if you have a question, I know you've got loud voices, but for the recording, we would like you to use the microphone. Are there any questions?
Nancy, could you tell us a little bit more about what NCJW USA does in Israel? You've got your own
I'd love
office
to.
there.
Thank you. It wasn't the topic of this talk, but it's something I love to talk about. So one of the things I felt most passionate about when I took the job at NCJW in 2011 was the Israel work, and have worked hard over 9 years to really focus it and tone it and make it more powerful. So we, NCJW US merged about 20 years ago with a giving circle called the U.S. Israel Women to Women. U.S. Israel Women to Women was a direct giving circle to Israel because there was a group of women who wanted to give directly and not through the Federation or UIA or ABC, DEF, etc. And so it was an opportunity to really start to have an impact. The problem was that for many years it sort of was a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, children with disabilities, women, It wasn't focused. And so what we tried to do over the last decade was to really focus it on a niche that we, I think, have really entered in a really would welcome your participating with us in, which is advancing women's leadership. And we've created a research study. Leanne came with us to Israel for International Women's Day a year ago, March, where we presented the results of, I think, a terrific research, and you can get it on the website of NCJW. It was a participatory action research study to really take note of where are things at in terms of the women's agenda in Israel, because nothing had been done like that for about 20 years. So we did this study over a year period, and then we presented the results. We had a meeting, a conference that had 200 Israeli feminists from all over the country, from all parts of society in Israel, Palestinian, Haredi, Ethiopian. No one had gotten them together in that kind of way ever. And we released the results of the study, and then we started talking to them about, well, what do you need? What do you think? And one of the things that came out was a concern that there was no container, there was no roundtable, there was no platform, there was no one pulling together these diverse sectors in the women's activist community. So we created a project called Connecting for Impact, Strengthening the Feminist Ecosystem in Israel. And we selected 17, well, we put out an application to be part of a cohort. We got 90 applications for what we were going to be 15 slots. We ended up with 17. And they have participated for the last year in trying to build an ecosystem. They came, and Miriam and some of you came to Washington, got to meet them, came to Washington to be part of our Washington Institute. And they are now going into phase 2, where they are working together to see what they can do to really advance women's leadership. So we've done a lot in the advocacy space. We've done a lot with programs around violence against women, but we've moved more into building women's leadership and trying to empower women to then take their organizations and amplify. Because if we give a $10,000 grant or a $5,000 grant to one small nonprofit program, that there's not an impact. But if you invest in a leader who is running a complete organization, you can get probably a bigger return on your investment. That's not to say we haven't continued. We fund a women wage peace. We fund Isha Leisha in Haifa, which has, I know you've done work with the Rape Crisis Center there. That's one of the organizations there. But that's sort of what we've done. And we've really energized I think, the community by focusing specifically, really mirroring what we do in the United States in Israel and trying to be there. Yes, the other thing that NCJW has done, two major things. One was we endowed in the 1960s the Research Institute for Education at Hebrew University, and then 20 years ago, we endowed the Tel Aviv University Gender and Women's Studies program, and I know you had Daphne Hacker here last year. Daphne is the head of that right now. And that is, it's called, by the way, the NCJW Gender and Women. It's not the NCJW US, it's the NCJW Gender and Women's Studies Project. And one of the things I want to do, this was sort of 20 years ago, and we could have let it sit. And this is an incredible opportunity. They're training women to work in gender studies. They're giving a gender studies degree. They're incredibly interesting women. We give a scholarship. It's a very, I think, nice way to invest. So we give a couple of scholarships each year. We've met the women who got the scholarships, and it's made a huge difference in their lives. And it was the first gender studies program in the Middle East, actually. And it continues to this day. We've just recently funded them to develop an alumni association so that they can build on a network of alums. And then we're involved in it tends to be more programmatic and advocacy, but we're also involved, we passed a resolution that we support a two-state solution, and we are trying in every way possible to continue to advocate for two states at a time when there's some questions whether there will be two states. And I can tell you that I was talking to one of our groups in Palm Beach, Florida, and someone said, well, who said there should be two states? And I would say, and I would say it here, well, if there's one state, which one do you want it to be, the Jewish one or the Democratic one? Because they're not going to have them both. So it's not political. It's just like if you don't have two states at some point, no matter whose land and what, we can fight and fight and fight. But if the government of Israel annexes the West Bank, either they give a vote to every Palestinian, we will no longer have a Jewish state, or they don't give the vote and we will no longer have a democratic state. And it's as simple as that. It's just as simple as that. And you can be wherever you are on the spectrum. I consider myself a centrist when it comes to Israel politics. Doesn't matter. If we do not figure out a way to have two states living side by side with peace and security, we will not have a Jewish democratic state. That's just the reality. Any other questions? Yeah.
Thanks, Nancy. I think you've managed to depress us very effectively. But there was a note of optimism at the end. I'm interested in the rise of anti-Semitism and whether the increased activism in the general population of Jewish organizations has had an impact on that in any way.
So this is a topic for the whole evening. We're very involved in the issue of anti-Semitism. We're most fearful about anti-Semitism of white nationalists who actually have guns and actually kill our people in the name of, killing the Jews. In fact, the shooting in Pittsburgh, which was so awful and really was a wake-up cry, all his emails, the shooter, were about Hayas and about the refugee and immigration work of Hayas. That was what he said. They're supporting people coming into our country. We know about Charlottesville and Jews will not replace us. There's now a lawsuit been filed by the Roberta Kaplan, who is the woman who got gay marriage passed in the Supreme Court. She has formed an organization called Integrity First. They have 20 plaintiffs, and they are suing the perpetrators of Charlottesville. They have all kinds of incredible material because these people are not very sophisticated. It's all over the internet that they were going there to kill people, and Jews and others, and they train them in how they can respond. So it's very, very serious. That's not to say that anti-Semitism on the left isn't also of concern. It is of concern. It's not of violent concern. That's not where the violence is happening, but it's of rhetorical concern. And we have a problem in the United States because we have something called freedom of speech. So we don't like it when people say things about Israel. Then there's the issue of what's anti-Semitism and what's anti-Israel, and are they the same or are they different? I'm part of a group looking at that right now. I don't think everyone who is critical of Israel is an anti-Semite. I don't think everyone who supports BDS is an anti-Semite. Some people do. I think some are. And so there's a very fine line. And, constructive criticism of Israel doesn't make me a self-hating Jew and doesn't make someone an anti-Semite. If you believe that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, or you don't want to delegitimate, Israel's right to be, then okay, you can say that that's anti-Semitic. But it's a very big conversation going on right now in the United States, particularly on the left, because of the concern about anti-Semitism, and on college campuses as well. It isn't as bad as it is in Europe. I don't walk down the street fearing for my life, but I do get concerned about my grandchildren who go to the JCC, and, every time I walk in there, I wonder about the security system, because it's so random. And again, the randomness has been all on the right. It's all been white nationalists. Sadly, and I could talk about that too, has been unleashed by this administration. It has been unleashed when he says that there are good people on both sides and talking about Charlottesville. There are good people on both sides? Seriously? So I don't care that he has a Jewish daughter-in-law. That's very nice. A daughter and a son-in-law. It's a Jewish son-in-law and a Jew by choice daughter. So, okay, great. But, if you're not willing to stand up and speak out, then we've got a problem. It's a great concern. And it feels like there's been an exponential increase, by the way, since the election of Donald Trump, according to the Anti-Defamation League, in incidents of anti-Semitism. Now, why is that? It's just exploded, because if it's condoned at the top, then it happens, in the grassroots. And those rallies that he has are pretty scary. So that's another problem. Yeah, Susie.
I'm not sure exactly how to frame the question, because I've got so many different thoughts in my head right now. But Trump was elected in spite of all the terrible stuff that was coming out before the election. The tape where he was very abusive to women. Women are voting for him. He has his base. It doesn't seem to be, I listen to a lot of podcasts, it doesn't seem to be subsiding in spite of what's going on. There seems to be this populism, and as you said, it's the anti-Semitism that goes with the anti-gay rights, the anti-abortion rights, all the right-wing agenda. And it's not as bad as Europe, but it feels like it's not far behind. And that's what's troubling, to me, that's what's troubling more than anything, is that in spite of everything that we know, and you get so much information, you don't know what's true, what's not true. Ukraine, were they culpable? Was Russia involved in the elections? Did they were they part of Hillary Clinton not winning the elections, that everyone thought it would be a landslide? So I suppose that's a statement.
No, well, but there are some facts, and this is part of the problem. The misinformation, it's shocking. And if you watched any of the hearings, it is shocking. The entire intelligence establishment in the United States, these aren't exactly left-wingers, have said that Russia interfered in the elections. No one ever said Ukraine had anything to do with the elections. Yeah. But it's fake news, because people watch Fox, and it's all they watch, and then they believe it. And he watches Fox, and he believes it. So it is very clear that Russia interfered in the elections. It's very clear that Russia wanted Trump to be the president. It's very clear that they had an enormous influence on what the outcome was. It really is very clear. And don't forget, he didn't win the popular vote. He didn't win the popular vote. So I'm an optimist. I believe that in the end, as Harry Truman said, we'll do the right thing. Because I just can't believe, otherwise I'm making Ali out of Melbourne, that it's possible that my country really believes that that we want to have a dictator and a demagogue and someone, at the top. I say that as nonpartisan as I can be, but it's not partisan. It's about the person. That's why I was trying to bring up all these different analyses. But Russia did interfere, and they're going to interfere again in 2020. And it's very clear. And it's just that's what's frightening. What's very scary is sort of what is happening, that the manipulation of our democracy, which is why I really wanted to bring out the things I did.
Pincus wants to be kind to you, Dorothy. And Julie will come to you next.
Thank you very much, Nancy. There are many millions of Jewish women who support Trump and his administration. In your talk, you seem to indicate that NCJW speaks with one voice. That can't be the case. There must be internally a conflict. Maybe not so much in the health issues and abortion issues, but certainly in issues such as Mexico, for instance.
Yes.
How does NCJW cope with internal conflict of such a scale?
No, it's a very good question. And of course, and we have we should remember that of the entire Jewish community in the United States, 75% of them voted Democratic in the 2016 election. So you're talking now, only 25% didn't vote that way, or didn't vote. And I'm as worried about the ones who didn't vote as the ones who voted differently. And you are absolutely right. There isn't unanimity. There is a disconnect, and I think we find it very, and this is unusual. It's very unusual for NCJW to actually talk about the person. And when this first started in 2016, I wouldn't let my staff. I said, well, it's not about Trump. It's about what we believe in and the policies. But what has emerged here is, sadly, it is about that, it's a new. I don't even know how to explain this. My grandfather was a Republican. He wasn't this kind of Republican. Do you know what I mean? The Senate, what is going on that no one is willing to stand up? Think about Nixon and the impeachment of Nixon. It's something really serious that has happened to our democracy. As far as NCJW, yes, but we have a board, and we make decisions, and I can speak to one that was very, very difficult, the Women's March. So the first go-round went well. And then the second go-round was local, so that was okay. By the third go-round, things had started heating up in terms of anti-Semitism and a couple of the leaders of the march, Linda Sasso and Tamika Mallory, and it got much hairier. And so I had a town meeting on the Zoom. We had a town meeting with our sections, and people were really angry, and they did not want us to be engaged as signers of the Women's March in the third go-round. And felt very, very strongly that these women were anti-Semitic. Whether they are or not the point, but they felt they were, and that we, NCJW, should not be putting our name on that march. And we didn't. What we did do was try to work behind the scenes quietly to influence the policies behind the march. Because and I was quoting the Israelis, we did this as a case study, and they said, you can't walk away from the table. I don't believe you walk away from the table, because once you walk away from the table, you have no power or influence. I did agree. I didn't want it to become I was really worried about splitting NCJW, in two or in half or, quarters or whatever. That so many of our people were so upset because of the headlines. So we didn't sign on, and as a result, many other Jewish organizations did not sign on, because we felt that we just couldn't, that too much had gone down, too much had happened. It was right after Pittsburgh, and there was just too much a sense of concern. So we didn't. Jews of color, by the way, took up the space, and they led the march. And it was much smaller and not as successful. But it was a painful moment, really was a painful moment. Since then, I will tell you, again, we've worked behind the scenes. The two people that were the concern are no longer on the board and no longer work for the Women's March. They have been removed. So, having relationships is sometimes important. I come out of the community relations world, and I remember when the Presbyterian community was going to was voting to divest from Israel at their big General Assembly that they have every summer. And one of my African-American Presbyterian minister friends, because we worked together in Boston on all kinds of, gun violence and, housing and healthcare and, and stuff that we had shared in common. He happened to be coming to speak at our annual meeting, and I called him and I said, Herman, would you denounce Presbyterian divestment at the meeting? It wasn't a quid pro quo. I wasn't going to tell him he couldn't speak if he didn't. He said, and he asked me to explain it to him, and I explained it to him, and he said, yeah, sure. That's the value of relationships. And people were like, oh my God, how did that happen? Well, because if you know people and you have a relationship with people and people understand it. I also took him to Israel on a trip with ministers, and there's a lot of other variations on that theme. But in terms of, no, we don't have a monolithic community. I'd say the majority of the community would support everything I'd say it in here. And, we have freedom of choice. You don't have to decide that you want to be part of NCJW or give your money to NCJW or participate in NCJW. There are plenty of other organizations. Yeah, but thank you. That's a good question.
Julie was in the kiosk. You can talk to Nancy.
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Julie's with the black and white dots. We make this the last one.
Thank you, Nancy. Thanks, Miriam. Julie Riley from the Australian Women Donors Network, and we enjoy a very warm relationship with Australian Jewish funders and NCJW Vic. I'm curious, given the situation you've outlined for women in the States, what's been the response from Jewish philanthropy? And is a gender lens becoming a stronger part of Jewish philanthropy?
Is what?
A gender lens, actually funding through a gender lens. And what would be your advice to Australian philanthropy?
Yes, yes, and yes. Actually a wonderful publication just came out from on funding with the gender lens that you can get on. I can give you the notation on how to find that online, and it's actually about funding with a gender lens. I think there's been increased funding by foundations with interest in funding with a gender lens. There's increased interest in philanthropy, I think, in general around this topic, and it in the United States it mixes with the Me Too. I'm on the executive board of the Safety, Respect, and Equity Coalition, SRE, which was developed. The Schusterman Foundation was sort of a leader in that, and a group of us came together a year and a half ago after the whole Harvey Weinstein Me Too stuff happened, and said, well, what about us? What about Jewish organizations? What are we doing in our own Jewish organizations to counter that? So we came huge. We raised $5.5 million very quickly, gave out grants, and I think it's been enormous success. Just hired an executive director for the first time. And, realize that, it can't be just about the other, it's about us and, our own organizations and how do we clean up our own. So there's a lot of interest, there's an increased interest in funding with a gender lens, and I think it's a turning point. It's taken a long time to get there. Okay.
If you just stand to the side there. I'd like to call Debbie Strouch, Vice President.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Debbie Strouch, as Miriam said, Vice President of the Victorian section of the National Council of Jewish Women of Australia. Just a little bit of information about us. We are a women's organisation. We are Jewish women working for the broader community. As you've heard tonight, the work that the National Council of Jewish Women does is quite broad, and I would encourage any of you who are interested in our organisation, consider being a member, go onto our database and have a look at what we do. We're also on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter for anybody that has those accounts, so please look up tonight and see what comes up for that. I'd like to thank a few people that have been involved in this evening. Sam and David Broder, who Miriam's wonderful sons who've been helping out. Dean, who's been taking photos constantly the whole night, and of course our wonderful women. We have Dorit, who's been running up and down. Dorita's on maternity leave. For those of you that wonder how our organisation functions with volunteers, she's actually an employee but is doing this during her maternity leave. I'd also like to thank other women who have been involved in this evening. I'd like to thank Fanny Redding, a wonderful woman, way before her time, a doctor in Australia, female Jewish doctor in Australia, in the days when I think she was the second one that qualified as a doctor in Australia, female doctor in Australia. I'd like to thank Hannah G. Solomon, without whom we wouldn't have Nancy with us this evening. And I would like to say that our organisations are very much aligned because we are both in this because of our passion for social justice, particularly for women and girls and families, and in Australia and in Israel. To quote various women, as Nancy has done, would be a little redundant at this point, but I'm very glad that she mentioned our own favourite Ruth Bader Ginsburg. If anyone hasn't seen any of the movies made about her, please do so now. She's the most wonderful and inspiring woman that has come out of the United States in a very long time. So to paraphrase Hayes, we help because we are Jewish. And that is our MO, the reason we are all here tonight. And on that note, I would like to thank Nancy very much for crossing oceans, continents and time zones to be with us here, and for her wonderful address on our special Fanny Redding Human Rights Lecture evening for 2019.
So thank you all for coming. That draws the evening for a close. Happy Hanukkah, and this is the last event for National Council for this year. Yes. See you next year.